Margaret Thompson had always been the kind of woman who needed to be the center of attention. At 35, she still turned heads when she walked into the local grocery store in their small Kansas town. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her makeup never smudged, and her clothes pressed to perfection. She had married David Thompson 12 years ago, drawn to his quiet strength and the security his construction business provided. David was different from Margaret in every way that mattered. Where she craved excitement and drama, he found peace in simple pleasures. He loved working with his hands, building homes for young families and coming back to his own house every evening to tend his vegetable garden. At 42, David had weathered lines around his eyes from years of outdoor work, but his gentle smile remained the same one that had first captured Margaret's heart. Their marriage had started with promise, but over the years cracks had begun to show. Margaret felt trapped in their small-town life. She watched other women from high school move to big cities, post glamorous photos on social media, and live what she considered real lives. Meanwhile, she spent her days working at the local bank, counting other people's money and dreaming of escape. The trouble really began when Sarah Martinez started working at the bank. Sarah was 28, recently divorced and full of life in a way that reminded Margaret of her younger self. Sarah had a laugh that filled the entire building and a warmth that drew people to her naturally. Within weeks of her arrival, Sarah had become friends with half the town, including David. It started innocently enough. David would stop by the bank to make business deposits, and Sarah would help him with his paperwork. She was patient with his questions about new banking procedures, and never made him feel foolish for not understanding technology the way younger people did. Margaret noticed how David's face would light up when he talked about Sarah's helpfulness, how he would mention funny things she had said, how he had started stopping by the bank more frequently than his business required. The jealousy crept in slowly at first, like water seeping through a crack in a dam. Margaret began watching David's interactions with other women more carefully. She noticed when he held eye contact a moment too long with the waitress at their usual restaurant. She saw how he smiled when their neighbor Mrs. Peterson complimented his garden. But it was Sarah who occupied most of her suspicious thoughts. Margaret started finding excuses to walk past Sarah's desk at work, listening to her phone conversations, watching who she talked to during breaks. She began driving past Sarah's apartment complex on her way home, noting which cars were parked there and when the lights were on. The rational part of her mind knew she was being ridiculous, but the fear of losing David consumed her thoughts more each day. David, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of his wife's growing paranoia. He continued his routines, working hard during the day and relaxing at home in the evenings. He would tell Margaret about his day, including his interactions at the bank, never realizing that each mention of Sarah's name was like adding fuel to a fire that was already burning out of control in his wife's mind. The first real confrontation happened on a Tuesday evening in October. David mentioned that Sarah had recommended a new restaurant in the next town over, suggesting that he and Margaret should try it sometime. Margaret's reaction was swift and fierce. She accused him of caring more about Sarah's opinions than hers, of spending too much time talking to other women, of losing interest in their marriage. David was stunned by the outburst. He tried to reassure Margaret, explaining that his relationship with Sarah was purely professional and friendly, nothing more. But Margaret's jealousy had already taken root too deeply. She saw his attempts at reassurance as lies, his confusion as guilt, his gentle nature as weakness that other women were exploiting. From that night forward, Margaret began planning. She told herself she was just thinking through possibilities, considering what she would do if her worst fears were confirmed. But deep in her heart, she knew she was planning something much darker. The thought of losing David to another woman, of being left alone and humiliated in their small town, was more than she could bear. Margaret's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would follow David to job sites, claiming she was running errands nearby. She searched through his phone when he showered, looking for text messages or calls from other women. She questioned their friends and neighbors about David's activities, always framing her inquiries as casual conversation, but hoping to uncover evidence of betrayal. David began to notice his wife's strange behavior, but he attributed it to stress at work, or maybe some kind of midlife crisis. He tried to be more attentive, bringing her flowers and suggesting they take a weekend trip together. His kindness only made Margaret's guilt about her dark thoughts more intense, but it didn't stop them from growing stronger each day. The final straw came when Margaret discovered that David had given Sarah his business card with his personal cell phone number written on the back. Sarah had mentioned needing some work done on her apartment, and David had offered to give her an estimate. To Margaret, this was proof of the affair she had been imagining. In her mind, the innocent exchange became evidence of secret meetings and stolen moments between her husband and the woman she now saw as her greatest enemy. Margaret's discovery of David's business card with his personal number written on it sent her spiraling into a dark place she had never been before. That evening, she confronted him again, this time with what she believed was concrete evidence of his betrayal. David patiently explained the innocent nature of the exchange, how Sarah needed help with a leaky faucet, and he had simply offered to provide an estimate like he would for any neighbor or friend. But Margaret was beyond reason now. The jealousy had poisoned her thoughts so completely that every explanation sounded like a lie. Every gesture of David's kindness toward other women felt like a personal attack on their marriage. She began to imagine elaborate scenarios where David and Sarah were meeting in secret, planning to run away together, laughing about how foolish and old Margaret had become. Sleep became impossible for Margaret. She would lie awake at night, listening to David's peaceful breathing beside her and feel a rage building inside her chest. How dare he sleep so soundly when he was destroying their marriage? How could he pretend to be the perfect husband while carrying on with another woman? The thoughts went round and round in her head until she felt like she might go crazy. During the day at work, Margaret could barely concentrate on her tasks. She watched Sarah constantly, looking for signs of guilt or secret knowledge. When Sarah smiled, Margaret wondered if she was thinking about David. When Sarah took phone calls, Margaret strained to hear if David's voice was on the other end. When Sarah left early one day for a doctor's appointment, Margaret was convinced she was really meeting David somewhere. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon, when Margaret overheard Sarah talking to another coworker about weekend plans. Sarah mentioned that someone was coming to look at her plumbing issue on Saturday morning. She didn't say who, but Margaret knew with absolute certainty that it was David. Her hands began to shake as she realized her husband would be alone with Sarah in her apartment, while Margaret was none the wiser. That night, Margaret barely spoke to David during dinner. When he mentioned that he had some estimates to do on Saturday morning, she felt like her worst fears were being confirmed. She watched him carefully, looking for any sign that he was lying, any hint of excitement about his secret plans. David, exhausted from a long week of work, simply ate his dinner and talked about ordinary things, completely unaware that his wife was building a case against him in her mind. After David fell asleep, Margaret sat in their kitchen with a cup of coffee that grew cold as she thought about her situation. She could confront Sarah directly, but what if that just drove them further underground? She could follow David on Saturday, but catching them together would destroy her heart completely. She could leave David, but the thought of starting over at her age terrified her almost as much as losing him did. As the hours passed, Margaret's thoughts grew darker. She began to imagine ways she could eliminate the threat Sarah posed. At first, these were just fantasies of Sarah moving away or finding someone else to focus on. But gradually, the thoughts became more specific and more sinister. What if Sarah had an accident? What if she simply disappeared? What if something happened to make David realize that Margaret was the only woman he should care about? By morning, Margaret had convinced herself that drastic action was necessary to save her marriage. She couldn't let David throw away 12 years together for a younger woman who didn't truly know him the way she did. She couldn't let Sarah destroy the life she had built, the security she depended on, the identity she had as David's wife. When David left for work that Saturday morning, Margaret was already dressed and ready to put her plan into motion. She had decided to follow him, to finally get the proof she needed of his betrayal. Once she had that proof, she would know exactly what she needed to do to protect what was hers. Margaret waited 15 minutes after David's truck disappeared down their street, then got into her own car and drove toward Sarah's apartment complex. She parked across the street where she could see the building entrance and settled in to wait. Her heart was pounding and her palms were sweaty as she gripped the steering wheel. At exactly 9 o'clock, David's familiar red pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. Margaret watched him walk to the building carrying his toolbox, looking like any contractor arriving for a routine job. But to Margaret, every step he took felt like a step away from their marriage and toward the destruction of everything she held dear. She sat in her car for 3 hours, watching the building, imagining what was happening inside Sarah's apartment. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Every laugh she heard from children playing nearby sounded like mockery. Every couple that walked by reminded her of what she was about to lose. When David finally emerged from the building, Margaret felt something break inside her chest. He looked relaxed and happy, the way he used to look when he came home to her after a good day's work. The fact that another woman could make him look that way filled Margaret with a fury so intense that she began to shake. As David drove away, Margaret made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She was done with watching and waiting and wondering. She was done with being the victim in her own marriage. If David wanted to choose another woman over her, then he would have to face the consequences of that choice. And those consequences would be more severe than he could possibly imagine. Margaret spent the following week in a strange state of calm that frightened even her. The rage that had consumed her thoughts for months had crystallized into cold determination. She moved through her daily routines at the bank with mechanical precision, smiling at customers and processing transactions, while her mind worked on an entirely different problem. She had decided that simply confronting David or Sarah would not be enough. Public humiliation, divorce proceedings, starting over alone. None of these options felt like justice for what she believed had been done to her. In her twisted thinking, Margaret had convinced herself that David deserved punishment that matched the crime she was certain he was committing. The idea came to her on a Wednesday evening as she was watching David work in his garden. He was preparing the soil for winter, turning over the earth with methodical care, the same way he approached every task in his life. Margaret watched the shovel break through the hard-packed dirt and found herself wondering how long it would take to dig a hole large enough for a person. The thought should have horrified her, but instead it brought a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, Margaret felt like she had found a solution to her problem. David wanted to betray her trust and destroy their marriage? Then he would learn what real betrayal felt like. He would understand the darkness he had created in her heart by experiencing his own darkness underground. Margaret began to research her plan with the same careful attention she brought to organizing the bank's files. She learned about soil types and drainage, about how long someone could survive in different conditions, about which tools would work best for digging. She told herself she was just exploring the idea, but she knew she was past the point of mere curiosity. The perfect opportunity presented itself 2 weeks later when David mentioned that he would be working late on a Saturday to finish a project before Monday's deadline. The job site was an isolated piece of land outside town, where a young couple planned to build their dream home. David would be there alone, working on the foundation prep while Margaret was supposedly spending the day shopping in the neighboring city. Friday night, Margaret packed a small bag with supplies: bottled water, energy bars, a flashlight, rope, and the sleeping pills she had been taking for her anxiety. She also gathered David's heaviest tools from the garage, claiming she was reorganizing the space when he asked about her activities. David, trusting and unsuspecting as always, even helped her move some equipment around. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that made the day feel later than it actually was. David kissed Margaret goodbye, telling her to drive carefully and have fun shopping. She watched him load his truck with the tools he thought he would need, not knowing that she had already prepared everything else required for what she planned to do. Margaret waited until David had been gone for 30 minutes before loading her car with her own supplies. She drove to the job site, taking back roads, careful to avoid the main highway where other people might see her car. The isolation that made this location perfect for David's work also made it perfect for Margaret's darker purposes. She found David exactly where she expected him, working methodically on marking out the foundation boundaries. He looked up with surprise and pleasure when he saw her car, waving and walking over with the smile that had once made her heart race, and now only reminded her of how that same smile might have been directed at Sarah. Margaret had prepared a story about wanting to see his work, bringing him lunch as a surprise, feeling guilty about leaving him to work alone on a Saturday. David accepted her explanation without question, pleased that she was taking interest in his projects. He walked her around the site, explaining his plans and timeline, completely trusting and completely vulnerable. When Margaret offered him the coffee she had brought, coffee she had carefully doctored with ground sleeping pills, David drank it gratefully. He had been working since dawn and was ready for a break. They sat together on a pile of lumber, and for a few minutes, Margaret almost convinced herself that this was just a normal Saturday, that she was just a caring wife bringing her husband refreshments while he worked. But as the medication began to take effect and David's eyelids grew heavy, Margaret felt that cold determination return. David looked at her with confusion as his words began to slur, asking if she was all right, if something was wrong. Margaret told him everything was fine, that he was just tired from working so hard, that he should rest for a few minutes. When David finally lost consciousness, slumping forward against the lumber pile, Margaret felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. There was only the mechanical need to complete what she had started. She had crossed a line that she could never uncross, and now there was no choice but to keep moving forward. Margaret dragged David's unconscious body to the area where she had decided to dig. The ground was softer here, easier to work with, and far enough from the road that no one would accidentally discover what she was doing. She began to dig methodically, the same way David approached his own work, taking breaks when she needed them but never stopping entirely. As the hole grew deeper, Margaret found herself thinking about their early years together, about the dreams they had shared, about the woman she used to be before jealousy had poisoned everything beautiful in her life. But these thoughts only made her more determined to finish. If David had valued their marriage, he wouldn't have put her in this position. If he had really loved her, he would never have made her feel the desperation that had led to this moment. The hole was deeper than Margaret had imagined it would need to be. Her hands were raw and bleeding from the shovel handle. Her back ached from hours of digging, and her clothes were covered in dirt and sweat. But she had reached the depth she wanted, deep enough that David would not be able to climb out on his own, deep enough that his voice would not carry to anyone who might pass by. David remained unconscious throughout the digging process, his breathing steady but shallow from the sleeping medication. Margaret had calculated the dosage carefully, wanting him sedated but not permanently harmed. Her plan required him to be awake for at least part of what came next. She needed him to understand what was happening and why. As the sun began to set, Margaret knew she was running out of time. David would sleep for several more hours, but she needed to get him into position before it became completely dark. Working in the dim light, she managed to maneuver his body to the edge of the hole and carefully lower him down using the rope she had brought. David landed at the bottom with a soft thud, still breathing normally but showing no signs of waking up. Margaret looked down at her husband lying in the dirt and felt a moment of doubt so strong it nearly brought her to her knees. What was she doing? How had her life come to this moment? But then she remembered the image of David smiling as he left Sarah's apartment, and her resolve hardened again. Margaret placed the bottles of water and energy bars within David's reach, but not close enough for him to grab them immediately upon waking. She wanted him to survive what came next, but she also wanted him to understand how helpless he was, how completely his fate now rested in her hands. The wooden boards came next. Margaret had chosen them carefully from David's own supplies, pieces that were strong enough to support weight, but not so heavy that she couldn't handle them alone. She laid them across the opening of the hole, creating a ceiling that would trap David underground while still allowing air to circulate. With the boards in place, Margaret began shoveling dirt back into the hole, not to fill it completely, but to weight down the boards and hide evidence of her work. Each shovelful felt like a decision she was making about the rest of her life, about the kind of person she was choosing to become. By the time she finished, the job site looked almost normal again. The hole was invisible beneath a thin layer of dirt and scattered debris. David's tools were arranged as if he had been working and then left for the day. Margaret loaded her own equipment back into her car and drove home, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. Sunday morning brought no relief from the enormity of what Margaret had done. She woke up in their empty bed, reached automatically for David's warm presence, and felt the cold shock of reality wash over her. David was buried alive in a hole she had dug with her own hands, and she had no idea if he was still breathing or if she had already become a murderer. Margaret called in sick to work on Monday, claiming she had the flu. She couldn't bear the thought of seeing Sarah, of pretending to be concerned about David's absence, of maintaining any facade of normalcy when her world had been turned completely upside down. By Tuesday, people began to notice that David was missing. His secretary called the house several times, worried that he hadn't shown up for important meetings. Margaret played the concerned wife perfectly, contacting the police to file a missing person report, organizing search parties, appearing on local television to plead for information about her husband's whereabouts. The police investigation was thorough, but ultimately fruitless. David's truck was found abandoned on a back road several miles from town, apparently broken down and left there. There were no signs of violence, no indication of where David might have gone on foot. The prevailing theory was that he had either met with an accident in the woods or had chosen to disappear, for reasons known only to himself. Margaret participated in every search effort, walked through miles of forest calling David's name, and broke down crying at appropriate moments when the cameras were rolling. But at night, alone in her house, she was consumed by the knowledge of what she had done and the terrible uncertainty of whether David was still alive. 3 days after she had buried him, Margaret drove back to the job site. She told herself she was just checking to make sure there was no evidence of her crime, but in her heart, she knew she was hoping to hear some sound from underground that would tell her David had survived. The site was exactly as she had left it. The dirt looked undisturbed, the scattered debris appeared natural, and there was no sign that anything unusual had happened there. Margaret stood over the spot where she knew David was buried and listened with all her concentration. But she heard nothing except the wind through the trees and the distant sound of traffic on the main road. Walking back to her car, Margaret realized that she had created a situation with only 2 possible outcomes, and both of them would destroy her life. If David was still alive down there, she would have to decide whether to rescue him or let him die. If he was already dead, she would have to live with the knowledge that she had murdered the man she claimed to love. The irony was not lost on her, that in trying to prevent the loss of her husband to another woman, she had guaranteed his loss in the most permanent way possible. But the jealousy that had driven her to this point was still there, still whispering that David had deserved whatever fate awaited him underground, still insisting that his betrayal had justified her own. David's first conscious thought was confusion about the darkness. He expected to see the open sky above the job site, but instead there was nothing but black emptiness pressing down on him. His head felt thick and heavy from the medication, and it took several minutes for him to realize that he was not lying on the ground where he remembered resting, but at the bottom of what felt like a deep, narrow pit. Panic set in quickly as David's hands explored his surroundings. Dirt walls rose up on all sides of him, too high and too smooth for him to climb. Above his head he could feel wooden boards that moved slightly when he pushed against them, but would not budge enough to create an opening. The air was stale but breathable, and somewhere in the darkness he could hear the faint sound of his own voice echoing off the earthen walls. As his mind cleared, David began to piece together what had happened. He remembered Margaret arriving at the job site, remembered drinking the coffee she had brought him, remembered feeling unusually tired afterward. The realization that his own wife had done this to him was more shocking than the physical reality of being buried alive. David found the water and food that Margaret had left for him, and the discovery filled him with both hope and terror. Hope because it meant she intended for him to survive, at least initially. Terror because it meant she had planned this carefully, that his imprisonment was not the result of some accident or moment of madness, but a deliberate decision to trap him underground. The hours passed slowly in the darkness. David rationed his water carefully and tried to preserve his energy, while thinking through possible escape plans. He used his belt buckle to scratch marks in the dirt wall, counting the days as they went by. He shouted periodically, hoping someone might hear him, but his voice seemed to disappear into the earth around him. On the 3rd day, David heard footsteps above ground. His heart leaped with the hope of rescue, and he began shouting with all his strength, pounding on the wooden boards above his head. But the footsteps paused for only a moment before moving away, and David realized with crushing disappointment that Margaret had been the one walking above his grave, checking on her handiwork. As the days stretched into a week, David's situation became increasingly desperate. His food was running low, his water nearly gone, and the physical strain of being trapped in such a small space was taking its toll on his body. But more than the physical challenges, David was grappling with the emotional devastation of understanding that the woman he had loved and trusted for 12 years had been capable of such cruelty. David began to understand that Margaret's jealousy had been far more serious than he had realized. He remembered the fights about Sarah, the accusations, the paranoid behavior he had dismissed as stress. He saw now that Margaret had been building a case against him in her mind, interpreting every innocent interaction as evidence of betrayal, every kindness toward other women as a threat to their marriage. The irony was bitter and overwhelming. David had never been unfaithful to Margaret, had never even considered it. His relationship with Sarah had been nothing more than friendly helpfulness, the kind of basic human decency he showed to everyone in their small community. But Margaret's jealousy had transformed these innocent interactions into something sinister in her mind, something that justified the unthinkable act she had committed. On the 8th day underground, David made a discovery that changed everything. While exploring every inch of his prison for the 100th time, his fingers found a section of the wall where the dirt felt different, more loosely packed. As he dug at this spot with his hands, he realized that he was near an old drainage pipe that had been installed years earlier, when this land had been prepared for a different construction project. Working with desperate energy, David managed to clear away enough dirt to expose a section of the pipe. It was old and partially collapsed, but it created a horizontal tunnel that led away from his vertical prison. The opening was barely large enough for him to squeeze through, but it represented his only hope of escape. David spent the next 2 days carefully widening the opening, working in complete darkness and using nothing but his hands and his belt buckle. The work was exhausting and dangerous. The loose dirt kept falling back into the space he had cleared, and he constantly worried that his movement might cause the entire structure above him to collapse. But finally, David managed to create an opening large enough to crawl through. The drainage pipe extended for about 20 feet, before connecting to a larger storm drain that led toward the main road. David squeezed through the narrow passage, scraping his skin raw against the rough concrete, pulling himself forward inch by painful inch. When David finally emerged from the storm drain on the side of the highway, he was barely recognizable. His clothes were torn and filthy, his hair and beard were matted with dirt, and his skin was pale from days without sunlight. A passing motorist saw him stumbling along the roadside and stopped to help, believing they had encountered a homeless person or someone who had been in a terrible accident. David was taken to the hospital, where doctors were amazed by his condition and his story. He was dehydrated and malnourished, suffering from numerous cuts and bruises, but miraculously alive after more than 10 days underground. The police were called immediately, and David found himself faced with the terrible task of explaining that his own wife had tried to bury him alive. Meanwhile, Margaret had been maintaining her performance as the grieving wife of a missing person. She had given several interviews to local news stations, participated in search efforts, and even started a reward fund for information about David's disappearance. She was at the bank, mechanically processing customer transactions and thinking about whether she needed to return to the job site to check on her husband's grave, when she received the phone call that shattered her carefully constructed lie. The voice on the other end of the line was calm and professional, but the words hit Margaret like a physical blow. David was alive, he was in the hospital, and the police wanted to speak with her immediately about his allegations concerning her role in his disappearance. Margaret's hands began shaking so violently that she dropped the phone. Around her, the normal sounds of the bank continued. Customers talking, computers humming, phones ringing. But everything seemed muffled and distant, as if she was hearing it all from underwater. The impossible had happened. David had survived and escaped from what was supposed to be his tomb. The drive to the police station felt like a journey to her own execution. Margaret's mind raced through possible explanations, denials she could offer, ways she might convince everyone that David was confused or lying. But deep in her heart, she knew that her carefully constructed performance as the grieving wife was about to crumble completely. Detective Sarah Chen was waiting for Margaret when she arrived at the station. The irony of the detective's name was not lost on Margaret, another Sarah who would play a pivotal role in destroying her life. Detective Chen was professional but direct, explaining that David had made serious allegations about Margaret's involvement in his disappearance, and that they needed to discuss the matter immediately. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, insisting that there must be some misunderstanding, that David had been through a terrible ordeal and was probably confused about what had happened to him. But when Detective Chen described the evidence they had already gathered from the job site, the disturbed earth, Margaret's footprints, fibers from her clothing caught on the wooden boards, Margaret's facade finally collapsed. The confession came out in a flood of tears and broken words. Margaret told Detective Chen about the jealousy that had consumed her thoughts, about her certainty that David was having an affair, about the months of planning and the terrible moment when she had actually carried out her plan. She spoke about the sleepless nights wondering if David was still alive, about the guilt that had eaten away at her, even as she continued to play the role of the concerned wife. What Margaret could not explain, even to herself, was how she had convinced herself that burying her husband alive was a reasonable response to suspected infidelity. The jealousy that had seemed so justified in her mind now appeared as the dangerous delusion it had always been. She had destroyed her marriage, her life, and her husband's trust based on fears that existed only in her own imagination. David's recovery was slow but complete. Physically, he healed from his ordeal within a few weeks. Emotionally and psychologically, the damage was much deeper. The man who had trusted everyone, who had believed in the basic goodness of people, now found himself jumping at unexpected sounds and waking up in cold sweats from dreams of being trapped underground. The truth about David's relationship with Sarah Martinez came out during the investigation. Bank records and witness statements confirmed that their interactions had been exactly what David had claimed: friendly, but completely professional. Sarah had indeed needed help with her plumbing, and David had provided a brief estimate before recommending a plumber who specialized in apartment repairs. The job had taken less than 30 minutes, and Sarah had paid David's consultation fee with a check that cleared through the bank's records. Sarah herself was horrified to learn about Margaret's jealousy and the role it had played in David's near-death experience. She testified at Margaret's trial, describing their limited interactions and expressing genuine sorrow that her simple request for help had somehow contributed to such a tragic situation. Sarah moved away from the town shortly after the trial, unable to bear the weight of knowing that her presence had triggered such destructive emotions in someone she had barely known. Margaret was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder, kidnapping, and assault. The judge, while acknowledging that jealousy could be a powerful emotion, emphasized that nothing could justify the premeditated attempt to bury another human being alive. Margaret's own testimony about her months of planning worked against her, proving that this was not a crime of passion, but a calculated attempt at murder. During her first year in prison, Margaret was required to undergo psychological counseling to address the mental health issues that had contributed to her crime. Slowly, painfully, she began to understand how her jealousy had distorted her thinking and led her to interpret innocent situations as evidence of betrayal. She learned about obsessive thinking patterns, about the difference between realistic concerns and paranoid delusions, about the dangerous spiral that begins when someone starts seeing threats that don't actually exist. David moved away from their small Kansas town after Margaret's sentencing. He sold his construction business and used the money to start over in a different state, where no one knew his story, and he could rebuild his life without the constant reminder of what his wife had done to him. He eventually found love again with a woman who understood his need to take relationships slowly, who didn't press him about his past, and who helped him learn to trust again. The case became a cautionary tale in their small community about the destructive power of jealousy and the importance of addressing mental health issues before they spiral out of control. The bank where both Margaret and Sarah had worked instituted new policies about workplace harassment and employee support services. The local newspaper ran a series of articles about recognizing the warning signs of domestic abuse and obsessive behavior. Margaret's story became a study in how jealousy, left unchecked, can transform an ordinary person into someone capable of extraordinary cruelty. Her case was referenced in psychology textbooks and criminal justice courses as an example of how mental health issues can escalate to criminal behavior when proper intervention is not sought. Years later, when Margaret was eligible for parole, she had become a different person than the woman who had dug a grave for her husband in a fit of jealous rage. She had learned to take responsibility for her actions, to understand the depth of trauma she had caused David, and to recognize the signs that should have prompted her to seek help before her delusions led to violence. But the most profound change in Margaret was her understanding of love itself. She realized that what she had felt for David had not been love at all, but possession. Love would have meant trusting him, communicating with him about her fears, seeking help for the anxiety and paranoia that had poisoned her thoughts. Love would never have led her to try to bury alive the person she claimed to care about most in the world. David's survival and escape had indeed been the work of fate, as the original story title suggested. But the real twist of fate was not just his physical survival. It was the opportunity his experience gave both of them to understand the difference between love and obsession, between normal relationship concerns and dangerous mental health crises. David never visited Margaret in prison, but he did write her one letter during her 3rd year of incarceration. In it, he told her that he had forgiven her, not for her sake, but for his own peace of mind. He explained that holding on to anger and hatred would only give her continued power over his life, something he was determined not to allow. He also told her that he hoped she would use her time in prison to get the help she needed and to understand why she had been capable of such violence. Margaret kept that letter and read it hundreds of times over the years. It became a touchstone for her recovery, a reminder that forgiveness was possible even after the most terrible betrayals. She used it to motivate herself through the difficult work of therapy, through the painful process of examining her own mind and understanding how she had become someone capable of attempted murder. When Margaret was finally released on parole after serving 12 years of her sentence, she was 51 years old and stepping into a world that had changed dramatically during her incarceration. She had no family left. Her parents had died while she was imprisoned, and her few friends had long since stopped writing. The small town where she had lived with David wanted nothing to do with her. Margaret moved to a large city where no one knew her story, found work as a night shift cleaner at an office building, and began the slow process of building a life as a convicted felon. She attended support groups for people with mental health issues and eventually became a volunteer counselor for women struggling with jealousy and obsessive thoughts about their relationships. Her work with other women, Margaret found a purpose that helped give meaning to the terrible things she had done. She could recognize the warning signs she had missed in herself. The sleepless nights spent imagining betrayal, the constant surveillance of a partner's activities, the growing certainty that every innocent interaction was evidence of unfaithfulness. When she saw these patterns in other women, she could speak with the authority of someone who had followed that path to its ultimate, devastating conclusion. Margaret never remarried, never even dated. She had learned that she was not capable of the trust that healthy relationships require, and she was determined never again to put another person at risk from her own mental health struggles. She lived quietly, worked steadily, and spent her free time reading and attending therapy sessions that helped her continue to understand and manage the thought patterns that had once made her so dangerous. Sometimes, late at night in her small apartment, Margaret would think about David and wonder what kind of life he had built for himself. She hoped he had found happiness